Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here in Edmonton. This is, I think, our 14th. Yeah, cool. This is about our 14th BDS town hall across the country. We've gone, and others, this time joined by Eve and Chris Alders, but many others have joined in this initiative. We've gone from Montreal all the way to Victoria and back again. And I found these experiences to be as educational for me as I hope they've been for members of the audience. And I do encourage you all in a respectful manner to engage in a debate, whatever your view about BDS may be, and about Palestinian issues. You know where I stand, but I invite contrary points of view. So I don't think we can really do justice to the whole question of Palestinian rights and the notion of whether we should support Palestinian human rights with a campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions without understanding the relationship between, the fundamental nature of the relationship between the State of Israel and the people of Palestine. You know, it's generally referred to as a conflict in the Western media and by political elites, which is true enough, but it doesn't convey information, any information, that word conflict, about the relative balance of power between the two sides. And it's going to be my thesis, my proposition to you, that any kind of a rational, objective review of the facts on the ground could lead to only one conclusion, and that is that the relationship of the Palestinian people to the State of Israel is one of oppressed to oppressor. Now, why would I say that? Again, I think even a cursory review of facts on the ground must lead us to that conclusion. First of all, as we all know, the State of Israel has had sovereignty for some 70 years, whereas during that period, the Palestinian people have had no sovereignty whatsoever, no state of their own. And under international law, they are as entitled to a sovereign state to self-determination as the Jewish population of Israel. They've not only been deprived of sovereignty during that entire period, but they've been subjected to a brutal occupation for almost 50 years. Now, in the context of that occupation, and not just in the occupied territories, but as I'm going to explain in Israel itself, the Arab Palestinian population experiences relative poverty, while the Jewish population of Israel experiences relative prosperity. And I'll give you a few notable facts in that regard. In 2014, Gaza's unemployment rate set a world record of 47%. You know, we think of the Depression-era levels of 25% as being devastating. This is almost double that level, almost 1 to 2 persons unemployed. In that same year, 2014, the West Bank, by comparison to Gaza, was in a state of opulence at 18%, but that too is approaching Depression-era levels of unemployment. The most recent figures I found for Israel are from August of 2016. The unemployment rate there was, by contrast, 4.6%, which is significantly lower than the unemployment rate here in our own country, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Israel, interestingly, has the highest poverty rate in the OECD at 21%, almost double the OECD average of 11%. However, the statistics demonstrate that in Israel, poverty falls disproportionately on its Arab population. According to a March 2011 report by the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, over 50% of Arab families in Israel lived in poverty. Of the 40 towns in Israel with the highest unemployment, 36 were Arab towns, and the employment rate for Arabs was a little more than 2/3 of that for the Jewish population of Israel. In September 2014, the World Bank reported that 1 in 4 of the population of the occupied Palestinian territories lived in poverty. There simply can't be any doubt that as between the two sides, Israel enjoys overwhelming military superiority. It has the Middle East's only nuclear arsenal and refuses, by the way, to accede to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has advanced fighters. It has tanks, drones, bombers, a missile defense system designed and constructed by the U.S., advanced attack helicopters and cruise missiles. It has submarines. It has a Navy, warship after warship, which it uses from time to time to fire upon fishermen, for example, trying to eke out a living off the coast of Gaza. Meanwhile, Hamas, which is the principal belligerent on the Palestinian side at this time, possesses what Israel-Palestine scholar Norman Finkelstein describes as glorified fireworks, the rockets, which statistics amply demonstrate are notoriously inaccurate. And as one would expect when there is so grotesque a disparity of military power, the casualties on the two sides are grossly disparate. In Israel's last 3 assaults on Gaza, nearly 4,000 Palestinians were killed, whereas about 90 Israelis were killed, of whom 70 were soldiers, and of whom 4 were killed by friendly fire. And of the almost 4,000 Palestinians killed, over 550 were children. So the ratio of child deaths on the Palestinian side to soldier deaths on the Israeli side was in excess of 5 to 1. In Israel's last assault on Gaza, nearly 3,400 Palestinian children were wounded, of whom over 1,000 were left permanently disabled. Imagine trying to care for over 1,000 permanently disabled, newly permanently disabled children in conditions of crushing poverty, in conditions of an inhumane siege where it's difficult to obtain medical supplies and medical equipment and run hospitals properly. In these 3 assaults on Gaza, which the Israeli military refers to obscenely as mowing the lawn, the overall ratio of Palestinian dead to Israeli dead was approximately 40 to 1. And this grossly disparate ratio in casualties has persisted for decades, and yet somehow, magically, the media in the West manages to portray the Palestinians as the aggressors in this so-called conflict. There can be no doubt from a legal perspective, whatever the history may be of the two peoples, that the settlements violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. This was so held unanimously by the International Court of Justice in 2004, including with the concurrence of the United States judge. Multiple Security Council resolutions, agreed to by the United States government, so declared. Canada, the US, and the EU have all acknowledged that the settlements violate the Fourth Geneva Convention. And you can go to the Foreign Affairs website even today and see a statement there to that effect, and a description of the settlements as a serious obstacle to peace. Year after year we've been saying this, and year after year we've done nothing to induce the Israelis to put an end to the settlements. Article 1 of the Fourth Geneva Convention declares that the high contracting parties undertake to respect and to ensure respect for the present convention in all circumstances. Therefore, Canada, as a high contracting party, not only has an obligation to respect the convention itself, it is also obliged by the treaty to ensure respect for the convention in all circumstances by its allies, to the extent it can reasonably do so. And by failing to impose meaningful sanctions, so as to help bring about an end to those settlements, our country is itself violating the Fourth Geneva Convention. What does Amnesty International have to say about conditions in the occupied Palestinian territories? These are excerpts from its most recent report. Quote, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Israeli forces committed unlawful killings of Palestinian civilians, including children. Israeli military police and security forces, quote, tortured and otherwise ill-treated Palestinian detainees, including children, particularly during arrest and interrogation. Just pausing there, our government is giving unequivocal support to a state that tortures children. On numerous occasions, again quoting, journalists covering protests and other developments in the West Bank were assaulted or shot by Israeli police and military forces. I represent one of those journalists, and her name is Rehab Nazal, and I'll come back to Rehab in a moment. Quote, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Israeli forces demolished at least 510 Palestinian homes and other structures built without Israeli permits, which are virtually impossible to obtain. So you're living in your own homeland, you desire to build a home, commercial structure in your own homeland, you must apply for permission to an external military power. It is virtually impossible to obtain permission. And if you dare to defy the external military power, your home will be demolished. Those are the conditions in which the Palestinian people live in the West Bank. Quote, Israeli forces maintain their land, sea, and air blockade of Gaza in force since 2007, imposing collective punishment on the territory's 1.8 million inhabitants. And I can assure you that collective punishment also constitutes a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, as does torture, as does the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure, as do the settlements. So our close ally, Israel, is in effect running roughshod over the Fourth Geneva Convention with the complicity of our government. Now, I mentioned Rehab Nazal. I've been to Israel and occupied territories on 4 occasions over the last 30 years, and most recently traveled there in April and May of this year in connection with my job. I'm acting, or was acting at the time for, I've since retired from the practice of law, but at that time I was acting for Eritreans who had worked at the gold mine of a Canadian gold mining company called Nepsun Resources based in Vancouver. They had been forced to work there for subsistence wages. And many of them fled the country, which has one of the most deeply repressive regimes on earth. And they went through Ethiopia, many of them. In fact, this was the standard trajectory for them. And then through the Sudan, and then up through the Negev, and they ended up in Israel, where today many of them, as they recounted to me, are mistreated quite badly by the government of Israel in violation of its treaty obligations for the treatment of refugees. And there's no doubt these people are political refugees. But after I met with them, I went to the West Bank to meet with Rehab Nazal. I had been retained by her several months earlier to try to eke out some measure of justice for her, because earlier this year or late last year, while she was filming the activities of Israeli skunk trucks in Bethlehem, and these are trucks that are pouring noxious fluids onto the homes of Palestinians, she was shot on the leg by an Israeli sniper. And this photograph is the last photograph that she took just before she was shot. And there, you'll see, it's a little bit difficult to make out, is an Israeli soldier pointing a rifle at Rehab. And she thinks that that's where the bullet came from. And that was supported also by the entry wound, or the placement of the entry wound. And she took me through the streets of Bethlehem, and then we went to the outskirts, and she wanted to show me something that I hadn't completely understood, and that is that the separation wall that Israel is constructing, and which is judged by the International Court of Justice to also be a violation of the 14th Convention, is not stationary, it's actually expanding. I thought it was done, it's not done. And it's relentlessly expanding and gobbling up more and more land. And this gentleman is a Palestinian farmer, he's 70 years old. And what you see behind him is what remains of an olive grove and a lemon grove, where he also has some beehives that have been in his family for generations. The wall is now being expanded. It's coming down the hill. Where we were, we had just entered into an opening in the wall because that day was the Sabbath and the soldiers weren't there. And so we were able to pass through that opening in the unfinished wall. And he took us into his grove, and he said to us, they're breaking my connection to the land. And as a member of the Green Party, that had quite an effect on me. It should have an effect on all members of our party, in my view. We then went back into the commercial center of Bethlehem, and we saw this, I was shown this part of the wall and also a watchtower, and you see there a little rectangular orange window, and Rehab explained to me that from time to time that window opens up, and an Israeli soldier points a rifle out and shoots rubber bullets at protesters in the streets. We then stumbled upon a shell of a building, a commercial building, which has been unfinished for quite some time because it has effectively been commandeered by the Israeli military as a point from which they launched tear gas onto protesters in the streets below. And as we were walking around, this is the second floor, I noticed everywhere there were spent tear gas canisters, and I gathered some up and put them on this wall. And as I was watching them, inspecting them, and some of them had clear markings from the United States, I heard some voices over the wall, and I looked over the wall, and I saw these children. And it was quite remarkable to me that these children, as you can see, flashing the peace sign, nevertheless, despite the crushing poverty in which they live, the oppression, the despair, dream of a decent life. They dream of peace, they dream of dignity, they dream of some level of prosperity, and we, as members of a civilized nation, and as a party that champions social justice, in my submission, have a duty, we have a moral duty, and we have a duty under the constitution of our party to help them achieve that dream to the best of our ability. I then asked Rehab to take me to Hebron. And the reason that I asked her to do that is because I had seen in March of this year during the AIPAC conference an interview of an extraordinarily courageous Israeli journalist named Gideon Levy, who's a relentless critic, and rightly so, of the Israeli government, and who has to walk the streets, I've read, of Tel Aviv, sometimes with a bodyguard to protect him from extremists who take issue with his criticisms of the Israeli government. And Max Blumenthal, a Jewish-American journalist, also a fierce critic of Israel, asked him, why do you always talk about Hebron? And Gideon Levy said, I would start there because there you get it in a nutshell. There is no other place where you can see the Israeli policy, the Israeli apartheid in the West Bank in such crystal clear colors. Roads are just separated for Jews and for Palestinians. An empty town because all the Palestinian inhabitants had to run away. I mean, those settlers terrorized them so much until most of them, there really remained only those who had no place to go. And you see the tyranny of the settlers, their brutality. They're the most extreme settlers, and they are. Part of them should be questioned by psychiatrists, I mean, really. And only a very small piece of land, and here he's talking about the small portion of the center of Hebron that they occupy, and in so doing, imposing tremendous oppression upon the population of Hebron. And he said, Gideon Levy, and that's the way it could have it will look one day if the occupation will continue, so you get it in a nutshell. So I wanted to see this apartheid in a nutshell. And first we walked through the old city of Hebron, where there was one store after another, and the merchants were standing in front of the shops, and there were no customers anywhere. Completely deserted. And it was amazing to me that these businesses managed to continue to function. And the merchants had plenty of time to talk because they have no business. Their economy is dying. And they pointed overhead, and I saw this. It was a mesh that they had erected over the cobbled streets of Hebron. And on top of the mesh was garbage. And they explained to me that the reason why they put the mesh there was because the settlers had taken over the units overhead and were throwing garbage down upon their heads. And they went on to explain that the nets aren't particularly useful sometimes because the settlers have taken to throwing filthy water down upon them and sometimes even excrement. Rehab, who accompanied me, then walked me through to a checkpoint to enter into the commercial center of Hebron, which has been ethnically cleansed for all intents and purposes of Palestinians. And you'll see that this is a heavily militarized checkpoint beside the tombs of the patriarchs. And we walked through without much incident because Rehab is a Palestinian Canadian. We both had a Canadian passport. But we got 10 meters or so beyond the checkpoint, and we were approached by 4 heavily armed Israeli soldiers, one of whom spoke some English. And he demanded to see our passports again. And Rehab, an extraordinarily courageous woman who, as I said, had only been shot a few months earlier in the leg for the crime of documenting Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people, stood face to face, nose to nose with them, and demanded to know why she was required to show her passport again. And initially, I stood right beside and I heard the conversation. Initially, he demurred, he didn't want to explain or have to explain himself. But ultimately, he got frustrated. He said, look, because only Jews can walk here. That's why I want to see the passport. He wasn't even shy about saying that. So eventually, nonetheless, because we had Canadian passports, they allowed us to continue. And as we were walking down the center of the commercial district, we kept running into walls like this, which had been erected to separate the Palestinian population from the settler population. The Palestinians are on the other side of this wall. We're now on the settler side. And it was explained to me by a German national who works for an NGO in the West Bank and has for a number of years, that the children who live on the other side of this wall have to cross the commercial center to get to their school, which is on the opposite side of the commercial center of Hebron. And because they are subjected to such abuse by the settlers, they have to be accompanied by representatives of various NGOs to protect them. And from time to time, after they get into their classrooms, Israeli soldiers will walk in and will demand to inspect their hands to look for what the Israeli soldiers claim is evidence that they've been throwing stones. And if the soldiers adjudge in their infinite discretion that they have been throwing stones, they'll occasionally take a child with them off to detention. And you can imagine a child 6, 7 years old having to live with this reality on a daily basis. You can imagine the trauma that these children experience. And I kept seeing this poster as we were walking through the commercial center of Hebron. Who is Ettinger? It says freeettinger.com. Mayor Ettinger is a settler who has been accused not simply by the Palestinian people authorities, but by the Israeli government of having firebombed the home of a Palestinian family. And in that firebombing, an 18-month-old baby was burned to death. The parents were so badly burned that they succumbed to their wounds a few weeks later, and the sole survivor of that family is a 4-year-old child who was also badly burned. In the minds of these settlers, this individual deserves liberty. He should be free. He's a hero. And anybody, including any member of our media, could walk through the streets of Hebron and see what I saw and report on it as I am doing. But you'll never see anything about this in the mainstream media in this country. Nary a politician in our parliament will mention such things, even though it's there for all the world to see. Now, our marketing document, as some people in our party like to call it, the Vision Green, contains the following statement. The Green Party of Canada believes that any effort aimed only at one side in this conflict, again that word conflict, will not end the violent responses that exacerbate human suffering. In effect, we are urging ourselves and our fellow Canadians to adopt a posture of neutrality. I much prefer the commentary of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and I profoundly disagree with this statement that the Vision Green contains. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu stated, "I have witnessed the systemic humiliation of Palestinian men, women, and children. The humiliation is familiar to all black South Africans. In South Africa, we could not have achieved our democracy without the help of people around the world, who through the use of nonviolent means such as boycotts and divestment encourage their governments and other corporate actors to reverse decades-long support for the apartheid regime." And this is the key statement: if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that that's precisely what you're doing. When one side possesses vastly greater economic, military, and political power, and is using it to suppress brutally another side that is virtually defenseless, and you say, "I'm not going to intervene," you're effectively inviting the oppressor to continue the oppression. So what does the BDS policy say, this policy that we've been told is so divisive and polarizing? It says that be it resolved that the Green Party of Canada supports the use of divestment, boycott, and sanctions that are targeted to those sectors of Israel's economy and society which profit from the ongoing occupation of the OPT. So let's just pause there. This isn't a boycott of Israel. It's not Israel. It's those sectors of Israel's economy and society which profit from the ongoing occupation of the OPT. Now, I've just described to you, with facts that one could easily ascertain are correct simply by consulting the rich historical record, the occupation and the nature of the occupation. In God's name, what could anybody find offensive about our country withdrawing, our fellow Canadians withdrawing support, economic support, for corporations and individuals who are profiting from that monstrosity, the occupation? Surely this is the minimum that human decency requires. The resolution goes on and says we will support BDS until such time as Israel implements a permanent ban on further settlement construction in the occupied Palestinian territories and enters into good faith negotiations with representatives of the Palestinian people for the purpose of establishing a viable, contiguous, and truly sovereign Palestinian state. So we don't even demand, as a condition of our withdrawing support for BDS, that the Palestinian people be given a state. We don't go that far. We say, look, just stop the settlements. Stop expanding and constructing settlements. Start negotiations in good faith. We'll revisit our policy, our support for BDS, and we may end it there. It would have been perfectly reasonable for us to go further and to say, no, we don't trust you anymore, Israel, because for decades you've claimed to be engaged in a peace process, even as you are confiscating land of Palestinians in violation of international law. That would have been a perfectly reasonable position for us to adopt, but we didn't go that far. And then we go on to say that the GPC, the Green Party of Canada, opposes all efforts to prohibit, punish, or otherwise deter expressions of support for BDS. Because after all, what could possibly be wrong with expressing support for BDS? Surely we at least have the right to express support for BDS. But no. The Conservative Party and the Liberal Party of Canada have adopted a resolution which effectively demonizes mere expressions of support for BDS, vilifies BDS supporters, much to their discredit. Again, there should be nothing controversial about that clause of the GPC's BDS resolution. How did the mainstream media react when we adopted this policy? On August 7th, the day of the vote, a Globe and Mail reporter penned an article titled "Vote to Support Israel Boycott Campaign Divides the Green Party." This reporter interviewed me extensively right after the vote outside the convention floor. I went out of my way, as I do every time I have an opportunity to speak to a mainstream journalist, which isn't often when I talk about, you can go and see about all the times the mainstream media wanted to talk to me in my capacity as a lawyer. I've been quoted dozens of times in the National Post in my capacity as a lawyer prosecuting class actions, dozens of times in the Globe and Mail. But when I talk about Israel, they don't want to know what I have to say. But I nonetheless will go out of my way to talk about Israel's human rights record. I did it that day, and not a word, not one word of what I said to that reporter appeared in the article. The story was almost entirely about the so-called divisiveness of the policy. The National Post on the next day, Green Party's Israel boycott Israel policy, which it isn't, by the way. It's a boycott occupation policy. Totally unhelpful to peace, Ambassador to Canada says. You can imagine of what country this ambassador, or from what country this ambassador came. This was the ambassador of Israel, of course. Do you think that the National Post interviewed somebody who speaks for the Palestinian people? No, that would be too much. We must not hear those voices. 2 days later, National Post, Green Party losing members, writing associations as BDS controversy highlights infighting. Again, the story is about the politics, the internal politics, not about the suffering of the Palestinian people. On August 15th, the Toronto Star, the supposedly progressive newspaper in this country, rather than fleeing the scene of its political car crash over policy in Israel, Elizabeth May should stick around and save her party from itself. Yet again, the story is the disintegration of our party, not the devastation of a defenseless people. The Hamilton Spectator, August 18th, the Greens' big mistake in Elizabeth May. There were, in fact, other voices out there speaking. For example, Tyler Levitan of Independent Jewish Voices, the next day in a press release stated, "This is the first time a Canadian political party with representation in the House of Commons has taken a strong and positive position in solidarity with the grassroots Palestinian movement for freedom, justice, and equality." And you'll see similar sentiments from Tom Woodley of Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. I encourage you to try to find any reference to either of these statements in the National Post, which owns over 170, Post Media owns over 170 newspapers in this country. Any reference to these statements in the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, the CBC, Global Television, CTV. No, these voices don't matter. You won't find them there. As it happens, we aren't, in fact, alone in this fight. Not in the Green movement, certainly. In the United States, the Green Party, over 10 years ago, adopted a policy supporting the full BDS movement. And I'm going to explain to you briefly why we don't go that far. Okay? And the political and media establishments, this is also the case in the United Kingdom. And in fact, the Scottish Green Party refers to Israel as an apartheid racist state. We don't use that language. We refrain from using that language. We don't even use the word war crime, even though the settlements clearly meet the definition of a war crime under the International Criminal Court's Rome Statute. Very restrained resolution. These parties have gone much further than us, and the environment for BDS is no less hostile in the United States and the United Kingdom than it is here. So why does our party have to blow itself up for support for a modest policy while these parties can continue to function and even grow while expressing support for the full BDS movement? No one's ever offered a plausible explanation for that. We've been alleged to have singled out Israel. Well, in 2014, the Green Party of Canada supposedly, or to borrow the phrase, singled out Saudi Arabia 2 years before we adopted this policy, with a call for a ban on military exports to that country, which has one of the most heinous regimes on earth. And in the election last year, when I ran in my riding of London West as a Green Party candidate, we were asked over and over again at all candidates' meetings, what do you think of this arms deal? We're selling $15 billion of weaponized personnel carriers to the Saudis. This question was asked repeatedly because those personnel carriers are being constructed in my own city, London, Ontario. And they account for 3,000 jobs in a city which has been hard hit by the decline in manufacturing in southern Ontario. I was the only person in my riding, the only candidate who took a stand against this deal. I went and I spoke to the independent media. I told iPolitics that, and they completely ignored what I had to say. I said it over and over again, as I said, in all candidates' meetings. Not one time was I ever accused of having singled out Saudi Arabia. Not one time was I told that I'm an Islamophobe or that I'm anti-Arab because I had singled out Saudi Arabia. Not one time, as far as I can tell, has anybody ever criticized our party in the over 2 years that have elapsed since we adopted this call for an arms embargo on Saudi Arabia. No one has accused our party of having singled out Saudi Arabia unfairly or of being Islamophobic or anti-Arab. But lo and behold, when you criticize the state of Israel, all of a sudden, you're an anti-Semite. There's a very interesting article that was written recently by an Orthodox Jew from the United States whose name is Michael Lesher. And he's a member of the rapidly growing Jewish Voice for Peace, a wonderful organization, one of the most rapidly growing social movements in the United States. And he said, there's a nefarious double standard that the propagandists of the State of Israel have developed, perhaps the most nefarious thing that they've done. Only when we can criticize Israel are we expected to yoke together with that criticism a condemnation of all the other human rights violators on the planet. But if you single out some other state and shine a bright light on that state's violations, that is acceptable. So when Netanyahu says that there's a double standard, he is indeed correct. There is a double standard. What he's not telling you is that the double standard operates to the advantage of the State of Israel and to the disadvantage of other states, whereas he would have us believe that it operates to the disadvantage of Israel. Of course, the masquerade of neutrality in our country is just that when it comes to Israel and Palestine. We are not, in fact, neutral. Canada subsidizes, for example, the racist Jewish National Fund by, according to a charitable status, the Jewish National Fund holds about 13% of the land in Israel and explicitly discriminates against non-Jews, doesn't lease or sell land to non-Jews. And in fact, the Israeli Attorney General himself some years ago opined, the Israeli Attorney General opined that this is a discriminatory organization. And I think he will have more to say about this particular organization, and yet it still enjoys charitable status in this country. Dozens of corporations in this country sell military and surveillance equipment and technology to the State of Israel or to companies operating within Israel. Canada has consistently sided with Israel at the United Nations. Of 193 UN member states, 136, a little over 70%, have recognized the state of Palestine as of September 2015. Their total population is over 5.5 billion people, equaling 80% of the world's population, but Canada has refrained from recognizing the state of Palestine, even though the people of Palestine have been stateless for decade after decade. It can hardly be denied that the United States isn't neutral when it comes to Israel. Just weeks ago, the United States announced the largest pledge of bilateral military assistance in United States history, $38 billion to Israel over 10 years. Gideon Levy said of this heinous accord, $300 for each U.S. taxpayer for the next 10 years, not toward America's considerable social needs, not to assist truly needy countries. Imagine what $38 billion would do for Africa, but to provide weapons for an army that is one of the most powerfully armed in the world, one which methodically defies the U.S. and the international community, and indeed, within days of the announcement of this historic military accord, Netanyahu announced that the Israeli government was going to allow the construction of yet another settlement in the West Bank, yet another war crime. And although Obama, quote unquote, strongly condemned this announcement, there's no indication that the $38 billion aid package will be reduced by even $1. Now, it's said that our BDS policy endorses a social movement, and that's a no-no. We shouldn't be endorsing social movements, we've been told. Why? Because we can't control what they do, and they may adopt tactics or policies or make statements that aren't in accordance with our values and our policies. But our own leader, during COP21 last year, endorsed the Leak Manifesto and was proud to say that we're the only party in Parliament to have endorsed the Leak Manifesto. I think it's a wonderful thing that our party has endorsed the Leak Manifesto. But why is it acceptable for us to endorse an environmentally related social movement, because that's precisely what the Leak movement is, but it's unacceptable for us to endorse a human rights related social movement? In fact, however, we don't actually endorse the BDS movement. The BDS movement has three goals. One is the right of return of Palestinian refugees. The second is full equality for Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. And by the way, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 194, which accords the Palestinian people, the Palestinian refugees, the right of return. Surely we don't have any quibble with the notion that Arabs living in Israel should have full equality, but we don't say anything about those things. And furthermore, the BDS movement asks or seeks the end of the occupation of all Arab lands and defines Arab lands not only to include the occupied Palestinian territories, but also the Golan Heights, which belong to Syria. We have nothing to say about the Golan Heights in our resolution. We deal with one narrow issue, and the narrow issue is the settlements. And I drafted the resolution in that way because there is near universal recognition that the settlements violate the 14th Geneva Convention. This is something about which we should all be able to agree. Moreover, not only are the goals of the BDS movement broader, but so are its tactics. It calls for BDS to be applied to anyone involved in the violation of Palestinian human rights, whether the persons, the victims of those violations, are in the occupied territories, in Israel itself, or in refugee camps. So we're only talking about the violations of rights of persons living in the occupied Palestinian territories. So actually, we don't go nearly as far as the US Green Party and the UK Green Party have done. We do not endorse the full BDS movement, although in my opinion we should. Now we're going to have a meeting because within 2 days of our having adopted this resolution, the leader of our party threatened to resign on national television, stating that she was devastated by our party's stance with respect to BDS. And within a couple of weeks of that threat of resignation, our federal council convened a meeting and called a further general meeting to be held in Calgary, hardly favorable ground for those who support BDS, in early December. And at that meeting, we are told we're going to revisit the policy. Now, although, for reasons I can discuss later if anybody wants to know, I've been removed from shadow cabinet. Scott mentioned that fact. It's related to my defense of the BDS policy. Although I've been removed, I've agreed at Elizabeth May's invitation to participate in discussions with a view to try to achieve a compromise. And in fact, I'll be in Vancouver this weekend to meet with select members of the shadow cabinet for the purpose of doing that, trying to achieve a compromise and restore some unity in our party. But I can tell you that the basic principle that I will defend to the very end is that any law which is never enforced is a dead letter. It's not worth the paper it's written on. International human rights law will never be effective to protect the Palestinian people unless meaningful penalties are attached to the violations of international human rights law. Israel has been effectively immunized from the consequences of its offenses, and therefore international human rights law effectively doesn't exist in the occupied territories or in the refugee camps or even in Israel itself insofar as Arab Palestinians are concerned. Now, it's also been said that this policy is distracting us from our core mission. Our core mission, we're told by some people within the party, is climate change and the environment. Well, these are the 6 constitutionally mandated values and principles of our party. 2 of them you'll see relate to the environment. One is ecological wisdom at the top, and the 5th one is sustainability. But the other 4 say nothing about the environment. And in fact, the words climate change, as important as climate change is, as critically important as it is to deal with that crisis, it's not even referred to in our Constitution. Those 4 other values are social justice, participatory democracy, nonviolence, and respect for diversity. These are fundamentally values of human rights. We are mandated by our Constitution to defend human rights. That is part of our mission. It's not a distraction from our mission. And you'll see here some of the policies that are an expression of our values. They're certainly not confined to the environment. We oppose Bill C-51. This law, this heinous anti-terror law, that's a frontal assault on our civil liberties. This is not about the environment principally. Bill C-51 is about human rights. We want a guaranteed livable income for all Canadians. We want post-secondary education to be tuition-free. We're the only national party with representation in Parliament to oppose the disastrous bombing of Libya, which has created yet another failed state in the Muslim world. So our policies are not confined to the environment, nor should they be. Now, if any of you is inclined to help us defend this victory for human rights, and you're not yet a member of the party, if you agree with those core values, if you want to help us defend the human rights of the Palestinian people, then I encourage you to become a member of our party. You can do that by paying $10 and become a member for a year. And if you're a member for at least 30 days prior to the vote, you will be eligible to vote in Calgary. And you can become a member simply by going online and filling out some basic information. And if you want to follow our campaign to support the policy, we have a Facebook group called Support the Green Party of Canada's BDS policy, and you can also follow us on Twitter. Whatever you do, though, whether you become a member of our party, whether you find some other way to support the human rights of the Palestinian people, I ask you to remember these children, because fundamentally it comes down simply to that. It is for them that we must ensure that human rights law is enforced in Palestine. Thank you.